Okay, so now we're going to look at some research from the biological approach. And this is really a favorite part of this class for me. I love this part of the class. This is, in particular, we're going to be looking at heritability studies. So remember that question, what percentage of your personality is actually passed down from your parents, your biological parents? And we're going to see how we got to that answer, how it is that we know what we know, and of course answer that question. We're also going to be looking at how birth order might affect your personality. I promised you that we're going to get to some really cool physiological studies. And then, how many of you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that you are night people? Okay, so how many of you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that you're a morning person? Usually we know what we are if we're on one or the other end of this scale. We're going to talk about that. But in psychology, morning people are called larks and night people are called owls. And, one of the really interesting things about taking psychology and majoring in psychology and taking these classes is that you learn the difference between real psychology and pseudo-psychology. So there's a lot of theories out there that claim to be psychology that are not. And you might have thought that was true with birth order. It kind of has that feel to it, right? But, and certainly there's some theories out there that are not psychologically grounded in science at all. But larks versus owls, there's some real difference here. We're going to look at that, and same with birth order. There are some ways that it really can affect your personality. We're going to look at that. So really interesting journey through the rest of this biological approach. I'm going to start with heritability. Now, we're going to take a little side journey here just through heritability. Don't try to write these down. You'll have plenty of time when we get to them. But we're going to start with selective breeding studies, okay? And that's kind of where this started. And then we're going to look at infant temperament, which adds evidence to this idea that perhaps, personality is at least partly inherited. Then we're going to look at adoption studies and twin studies that pretty much tie up the knot, and show you how we know what we know and answer that question more definitively. So we're going to start out here with selective breeding studies. So here's the idea. If you're thinking that personality might have a hereditary component, okay, one of the things you can do is look in archival data, right? So you can look at selective breeding studies and see if they really are successful in breeding, for instance, certain breeds, certain kinds of dogs to exhibit more of a particular personality trait. Okay, and we find that there's really high successes in the field. There are some really high successes in selective breeding. Here's a few examples here. That pit bulls can be bred to be aggressive, and often are, not always. Labs can be bred to be sociable and friendly. So there's been a lot of breeding of that in the past, and we see that on the part of most labs now because they're coming from a lot of those pools. Sociable and friendly, so good family pets. That's a particularly really intelligent breed, by the way. Oftentimes used for assisting people who are visually challenged, for instance, because they are so very smart. And then there's Chesapeake Bay. That's another very strong case for selective breeding of loyalty in particular. So not the best family dog, but a really good one-person dog, right? Chesapeake Bay overall. So the idea here, is that there must be a hereditary component, at least with dogs, right? Because we see this selective breeding being very successful. And by the way, when we say successful, what is considered successful is 70%. So 70% of their pups show a high level of that trait, okay? 70% or higher. All right, and then the next step, but that's dogs, right? That is not human beings, and we really need to move a step forward here and look at human beings. So we notice that infants already show differences in personality. Now, we don't really call it personality when we're looking at infants because they can't display enough behaviors yet for us to call it that, but they certainly show different dispositions. Um, and, that being a large part of personality is really a cue that maybe there really is a genetic component here. And we see these differences oftentimes right at birth. So if you have any experience working with newborn babies, okay, babies plural, newborn babies, okay, then you know that sometimes you can pick up a baby, a particular baby, and it's like it melts into you, okay. But you pick up another baby, newborn baby, and they stiffen up. Okay, so there's a real difference there, and that's actually this model we're going to be looking at. That's a sociability component. But there are definite, disposition differences right from birth. Okay, so they must be, dispositions must be largely inherited, and even if they aren't obvious, immediately at birth, which they often are. They're certainly obvious before a year old. This model that we're going to look at, these are the three things in which we tend to see the most difference between newborns, all the way through that first year, in temperament, in their disposition. Okay, and it's called the EAS temperament model. Which is aptly named for EANS, these three words. Emotionality this is an interesting one. How easily does that child cry? How easily does that child get tired or fatigued? How easily does that baby get angered? Okay, that's what they're measuring with emotionality. Really big difference between babies right away at birth. And then we've got activity. And this, you could just think of this as a general level of physical activity. In other words, energy output. Okay, how often does that child move around? Does he or she prefer games that really require a lot of physical activity? If they're too young for that, do they move their arms and legs around a lot? Do they get excited when you do that and move their limbs around like that? If they're forced to sit still, do they tend to squirm and fidget? So babies really differ on their activity level, just like we do as adults. We carry that through us, through our lives. So, when I teach this live class, there's always a few students in the front row who are those foot waggers. And we know who we are, right? But what that indicates, foot wagging oftentimes is that person has a high activity level or energy level, and that they actually can focus better on the lecture if they are wagging their foot or moving some kind of part of their body in that way. In other words, they're releasing some of that energy, which makes them more comfortable and more able to focus, right? And then the third one here is sociability. And, generally speaking, how much does that baby enjoy being around other people and other babies and other adults? And, do they kind of, when they're old enough to do so, do they seek out others to play when they're too young to do so? Do other people in the environment draw their attention? You can follow their eye tracking. Does they draw, or are they more attracted to objects or people like the same as objects? Okay. So how much do they enjoy other people? How much is their attention drawn? How responsive are they when you talk to them and play with them? Okay. But very interesting, right from birth. So again, this really suggests that personality has an inheritability component, but it really doesn't prove anything yet, right? We need proof. We want proof. This is a science here, and this is great, developing theories from this kind of suggestive data, okay? But we need to go further before we can make this claim and have some proof. So let's move on now to adoption studies, a step in the right direction, okay? We're working with people, we're working with not only people, but adults, have had time to really develop their personality. And so that if there's a learning component, it's had plenty of time to come out too, right? And we've got numbers involved now. We have a real correlational study, in fact, many of them. And these studies, think about it. If there's a heritability component to personality, who do you expect to be more like? You expect these adoptive kids to be more like their biological or their adoptive siblings. And we find that they're much more like their biological ones, indicating some heritability in personality. So these are correlational studies, many of them indicating this. Also, if there's a heritability component, we expect these adoptive kids to be more like their biological parents than their adoptive parents, even though they haven't had exposure to them, just like with their biological siblings. And in fact, that is what is found again over and over again. And then most impressive of all, okay, and most conclusive are twin studies. So we can add this to the adoption studies, twin studies, and in particular, twin studies that look at the difference between monozygotic and dizygotic twins. So you probably know monozygotic twins are identical twins. They're always the same gender, right? Like these little boys here. And dizygotic twins, okay, are not identical twins, or what is more commonly called fraternal twins. And they even can be different genders. And, tell me this, what percentage of their genetic material do they share? Monozygotic twins first, okay? And if you thought or said 100%, you are right. They share 100% of their genetic material, okay? What about dizygotic twins? It's about 50%, no different than any other non-twin sibling, okay? So here's your third question. If there really is a hereditary component to personality, who do you think are going to be more alike in personality when measured? And we do a correlational study. Where do you expect those correlations to be significantly higher? And that is, of course, with the monozygotic twins. And that is what was found. And again, over and over and over again, this is found. So we have many studies filling up the journals, all showing the same thing, significantly higher correlations with monozygotic twins compared to dizygotic. And then when we thought, okay, everybody had pretty much accepted this is a given, right? And you can even, hone it down to percentage, but just we thought we were comfortable, and we really had definitive evidence for the answer to this question. Along comes somebody who critiques these studies, and they come up with a critique that is really valid, okay? And so what would you think? What the researchers are all trying to claim is that monozygotic twins are more alike in personality than dizygotic twins because of genetics. But tell me this, what else could it be? Okay, what else could it be? Why might they be more alike in personality? Okay, and some of you may have guessed this, but here was the really valid critique. Okay, monozygotic twins have a tendency to be treated more alike. So that they may be more alike in personality, but from the learning component after they were born, not genetics that they were assigned before. before their birth. So that's a really valid criticism. And what it meant was all the researchers had to go back to the drawing board again, and they had to redo all these studies. And this time they had to do them with monozygotic and dizygotic twins who were raised apart. So raised apart. I mean, you think about this. Monozygotic twins are treated more alike when, obviously, when they're together and the parents are raising them, right? So when they're together, they look alike, so people have a tendency to dress them alike, as you see in this photograph, to enroll them in the same, like, extracurricular activities. So they're treated much more alike. In a lot of ways, dizygotic twins are much less likely to be dressed alike. And in fact, like we said, sometimes they're different genders. And we actually see more of a gender pull on what people assign them into on extracurricular activities. There's a really strong bias there. So monozygotic twins are treated more alike when they are raised together. So to control for this, all of those studies had to be redone with monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins, all who've been raised apart. Okay, so you have to go to the trouble of finding that many twins who were raised apart in both groups. Okay, but the thing is, they came up with the same thing again. So very, very strong difference in the correlations, with the monozygotics being significantly higher even when they're raised apart. And again, these journals fill up with articles of this. They're all showing the same thing, and it really looks conclusive, right? Definitive. We know the answer here. And then comes another smart aleck, okay? Somebody who says, oh, but wait a minute, I thought of another possible reason for this relationship. What would cause this relationship to be stronger, between monozygotics and their personality than dizygotics? And that is, this is what they came up with. They said, you solved this problem from birth on about being raised together. And you found all these twins raised apart, but you really weren't thinking about the prenatal environment before birth. And, here's the deal. Sometimes something happens in the prenatal environment with monozygotic twins that never happens with dizygotic. Sometimes it happens with monozygotics, and sometimes it doesn't. And that is, sometimes monozygotics share the same placenta. So remember, all these things need to be ruled out, right, before we have our answer? Well, the difference in the correlations was so strong already that they didn't think it would change the overall answer, but it certainly might change that percentage number that they had come down to, that I'm keeping as a surprise for now. But the researchers had to go back to the drawing board again and do all their studies, and this time they had to not only find all this number of monozygotics and dizygotics who were raised apart, but all of them with unshared placentas. So they had to make sure that all of the monozygotics also were screened, and only the ones with unshared placentas were part of the study. And again, they found the same thing. And that magic number, what percentage of your personality, comes from your parents genetically, is actually approximately 50%. And I say approximately because that changes for different traits. And I'll tell you something, just like Hans thought. Remember Hans Ising with his super traits, right? Just like he thought, there are certain traits that have much higher heritability components, and then 50%, much higher than that. And in fact, the big five are examples. Okay, so, but overall, about 50% of your personality is passed on through your parents. Okay, let's look a little closer at these numbers And again, you might look at this and you might say, well, that the math doesn't add up here if you're going to say overall 50%, 40%, 20%, right? The math doesn't add up. But understand it never does when you're making estimates like this because you're going across these different studies, different groups of studies. And so I'm also showing you the range here, the lowest and the highest that they found across many different studies, and then the agreed upon estimate. Okay. So overall, the big question, the really big question is what percentage, is from your parents. And that is 50%. The lowest study shows 40, and the largest study shows 58%. Okay. So they range all the way from 40 to 58. This is across many different traits. If you break it down by trait, it can get higher or lower. But it averages out to about 50%. Okay. Now, then there's something more interesting that we can look at. That is, what is the difference between about what is actually inherited that is due to a shared environment versus an unshared environment? When we say shared environment, kids that are raised together are raised in a shared environment, right? Okay. So wouldn't you expect that maybe to be higher than the unshared environment with these kids in the same family? No, in fact, if you look at this, the unshared environment has almost twice the influence, genetically speaking. There's a genetic influence that's almost twice as strong. Well, why would that be? So kids in a family, what is unshared, okay, between them has more of an effect on the personality than what is shared within that environment. Okay, well, that's, when we say shared environment, first off, we have a lot of what we think of as shared is really unshared. Because we tend to think, oh, their home life was all the same. But siblings can experience very different home life even when they live together. In this case, they're living together. So why might that be? Hey, I want you to think about this for a minute, maybe even pause the video and see if you can think of a few different reasons why kids might experience things differently within the same family. And then click that video back on, because now I'm going to tell you the answer. Okay, answers actually. So much of what we think of as a shared environment is really unshared. And for example, there's differential experiences outside the home. So if these kids aren't at home all the time, obviously they're out playing with their friends. But you probably all thought of that, right? That they're going to have different experiences outside the home. They might be in different extracurricular activities. They're in different classes at school. They have different groups of friends, even within the neighborhood, depending on their ages and such. Okay, but there are a lot of other experiences in the home. There are a lot of ways that siblings are treated differently within the home. And so let's see how many of these you thought of. For instance, gender. There's a large difference, unfortunately speaking, in how males and females are treated oftentimes within the home. There are differences with birth order. You're treated differently depending on birth order. Okay, there's differences sometimes because a family can be experiencing very different financial environments at the time that the kids are born. So, for instance, maybe the first kid's born and the parents are not yet established in their careers and they're struggling. But by the time that the next child is born, several years later, okay, they're pretty middle class, they're pretty established in their careers, and they're much more comfortable in the financial situation. So that's another example, of how these kids might experience something very different within the same household. Now, think of the reverse of that in this current economy. We had a crash of the economy, so where an earlier child may have experienced a more financially influential household, Okay, a later born child might have not done so at all. In fact, some families have lost their homes. Okay. Um, Also, there can be changes in parenting, right? Parents can get better at parenting as they go on, and many other examples. Okay. But we mentioned birth order, and that's where we're going to go next in our next lecture segment.